Hey, what's up, guys? So welcome to AP US History. This is going to be Chapter 1 Notes, Colliding Worlds from 1450 to 1600. We're going to be talking about the Americas, Western Europe, West Africa, Exploration and Conquest. So this is your outline in terms of your notes. So here's our world. But today, our focus is going to be the Americas, including Mexico and the US, Western Europe, Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, and West Africa. We're going to start down here with Mexico first and look at the civilizations that were on your outline. First of all, the Aztecs. This is before 1519. That is before contact with the Europeans. So the Aztecs settled in Tenochtitlan, which is the current city of Mexico City, which was part of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs settled there in the early 1300s. They had a dense population of about 250,000 people. Now that population density was much more than many European cities. At the same time, they had a productive agriculture based on maize or corn and an aggressive bureaucracy with one leader. Now, power was kept through trade and tribute and warfare. And the leader was the one that made sure that other tribes, other Native American tribes in Mexico paid tribute. Some of the goods that the Aztec had were gold, textile, turquoise, obsidian, and cacao. And cacao is pretty much chocolate. And we're going to see how that also plays a major impact. Now, the Aztec, unlike usually people think, they were an advanced civilization with great structures. And you see that over here on the left-hand side with this picture. This kind of gives us a little glimpse of what the Aztec capital looked like. Some of these temples went as high as about 70 feet high. So it was a pretty good structure for that time as well. Some of the bigger and taller buildings were in the Aztec Empire. They were animists, and animism is the idea that everything has a spirit, including animals and plants. So they did a lot of sacrifices, and these temples, many of these structures were temples, they were used for some form of sacrifice. The Aztecs did worship the sun god, the moon god, the rain god, fertility, so on and so forth. So they did use human sacrifice, which unfortunately is a very horrible practice. But a lot of times those human sacrifices were captives from war. That's not to justify their actions, but it was not the people that, their own people that they sacrificed, again, like some people believe. The Aztecs did come into contact with the Spanish settlers in 1519. Let's move up a little bit north now, and this is in southwest the US, current day New Mexico. So we're going to talk about the Pueblo Native American now. Now their society went from about the 800s to about the mid 1100s. They were also had great architecture. They did stone buildings with multiple stories and hundreds of rooms, and you can see that in this picture here. This was some other dwellings, and this was built in the 800s, 900s, and this is a group of people that were touring that area. You could still tour today, which is amazing because almost 1,000 years later, those structures are still pretty much intact. Roads connected the communities as well. Now, the Pueblo also were able to thrive because of the three sister crops. The three sister crops were corn, beans, and squash. That was what sustained their civilization. The Aztec, for the most part, relied on corn and corn only, and that product moved up north. So the Pueblo were able to also sustain their civilization through these three sister crops. Make sure you know that. Because of that, they were able to have sizable villages and adobe homes molded into sheer canyon walls, again, as the picture shows. They did have advanced irrigation projects to manage scarce water. They lived for the most part in the desert. Unlike the Aztecs were surrounded by water, and they also needed some form of ingenuity to be able to survive there. But the Pueblo lived in the desert, and so they were able to manage these irrigation projects to be able to thrive. The Pueblo also traded with other native tribes around the area, the Navajo and the Apache. They actually had annual trade fairs where goods like hide, meat, maize, pottery, and cotton blankets were traded among the tribes. So there was some form of community, there was some form of collaboration as well. The Pueblo also came into conflict with the Spanish settlers over religion and labor in the 1540s. So far, the Aztecs and the Pueblos came into contact with the Spanish. Now let's move up a little bit to the East Coast. So this is more or less Virginia. This is what becomes known as the Chesapeake Bay. This is a Powhatan Confederacy. A confederacy is a group of people. Now they were located in the James River in Virginia. They had one main chief, the Powhatan, which he ruled with the help of other chiefs. So this was very similar like the Aztecs. They lived in small towns. Now, we do have gender roles here. Women farm, forage in the woods and marshes. They prepare food, made household equipment, and sometimes they even made their own houses. So women had a major influence in terms of the Powhatan Confederacy. Men, on the other hand, they hunted, they fished, and they made war. This was a matriarchal society, meaning that heritage was passed through the female side. So we see again the importance of females, and we're going to see how that changes also when they come into contact with European powers. They had communal land, meaning that nobody owned the land, no private ownership, everybody worked it, and it was everybody's land. The Powhatan came into conflict with English settlers in the early 1600s, so different than the Pueblo and the Aztecs. Staying in the East Coast, but a little bit up north now, we're going to go to the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois, they would live in current state New York, and you see that in the insert map right here. They were formed by 5 tribes: the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. They were the most powerful Native American group in the Northeast. They made decisions based on councils, a group of people, decisions such as when to go to war, and peace treaties that were supposed to be signed. And this becomes major also when they come into contact with European powers. Now, like the Powhatan, this was also a matriarchal society, power inherited through the mother side. Men did serve as leaders, they went to war and conducted diplomacy. Also, like the Pueblo, they survive on the 3 sister crops: corn, beans, and squash. Again, make sure you know that. And the Iroquois, for the most part, it started their rise to power in the mid-1400s, and the Iroquois still are around today. They came into conflict with French settlers in the 1600s over land and resources. And as such, the Iroquois actually allied with the British, who were the French's long-term nemesis. So we start seeing an alliances between Native Americans and European powers. So that was the Americas. Now let's move on and talk about Western Europe between the 500s and the 1400s, more or less. So this is more or less the Dark Ages. Western European countries include Portugal, Spain, and France. They were all ruled by monarchs and nobles who controlled land and people. Now, this was a patriarchal society, meaning that inheritance was passed through the men's side, so different than some of the Native American societies. Men ruled, and women were in subjugation to men. They took their husbands' names, they surrendered their property when they married, and they needed to follow the men's rules. So, unlike Native American women, Western European women didn't have much of a role. Society was ruled by hierarchy in politics, religion, and family, and all of that impacted American society later on. And all of this was, again, the hierarchy in politics, men rule; in religion, men rule; in the family, men rule. So we start to see the impact of gender roles already. Italy was not part of Western Europe, but they do influence ideas in America. Italy was actually run by a republic, which is elected people that other Italians elected to rule. That's a republic. They also had this idea of civic humanism, where they praise public virtue and the individual's abilities to contribute to the society. In that way, they were able to serve the state. So, if an individual had knowledge to be able to run politics or run an economy, then that individual usually was elected to run the country. And again, that influences American ideas in society, politics, and religion as well. That was a brief introduction to Western Europe. Now let's go down to West Africa. So West Africa, we're talking about the 700s to about the 1400s. So we do have Western African kingdoms here, and most of the times they relied on military strength and trade to stay in power. That trade was based on the Trans-Sahara trade route. I'll talk about that in a minute. But these kingdoms had a dense population that usually led to war over resources. So since there's a lot of people, and in Western Africa, there's the biggest desert in the world, the Sahara. Yeah, it was a big location, but there was very few resources. However, the resources that did exist were very valuable. Like Native Americans, Western African societies were animists, so they believed that everything had a soul. Eventually, when Islam spread, a lot of these West African societies took up the Islamic faith. They became Muslims, monotheistic. And that also comes into conflict with some Western European countries. So the Trans-Sahara trade route, the major commodity here was gold, copper, salt, and slaves. Eventually, gold becomes one of the major ones, and then slaves, I would argue, became the most important one. Slavery within the African tribes were used to pay off debt, were used in exchange for food, or were used as war captives. So yes, slavery did exist in Africa, but when the European powers start to trade with African countries, in particular Portugal, they start looking at slavery as other forms of commodities and economic resources. So Portugal becomes the first European country to trade with West Africa. And Portugal was looking south to Africa to enrich their economy. Now, this is where we see the colliding worlds, which is the title of the chapter. So we have Portugal and Spain, and now we have West Africa, and these countries all come together. So Portugal, as we already mentioned, was the first to buy African slaves for agricultural purposes and also for military recruit. And when sugar plantations were introduced, slavery exploded because Portugal went down to West Africa and bought thousands of slaves to work on these sugar plantations. By the 1400s, Portugal, Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, had over 9,000 African slaves living in Portugal. Well, Portugal is getting pretty wealthy out of the slaves, so the Spanish monarchs, which is Portugal's rival and neighbor, Ferdinand I or II and Isabella I, they are the king and queen of Spain, they set out to compete with Portugal. So they reunified Spain, and in 1492, the Spanish monarchs financed Christopher Columbus' voyages in search of India's riches. And that is where we have the third collision between the Americas, Africa, and eventually the Western European powers as well. So that was chapter 1. We'll continue a little bit more talking about this in class.